Nora Callahan had worked the Giant Sequoia National Monument for 12 years when she crawled through a gap in an ancient tree's root plate and found an iron door that had no business being there. Behind that door was something that would change everything she understood about the mountains she had spent her adult life walking, about a family history she thought was settled, and about what it was possible for one person to find when the wilderness decides to show you something it has been keeping for a very long time. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to the ranger station at Marble Fork sat at 6,800 feet on a shelf of granite where the forest thinned and the canyon opened up to the west, and on clear mornings you could see the foothills stepping down toward the valley floor 60 miles away, and past that on certain winter days the flat expanse of the Central Valley like a tray of gray water. It was a single-story building with a barrel stove that worked most of the time, a bulletin board covered in laminated trail maps and fire risk ratings that nobody updated quite as often as they should, and a coffee maker of uncertain age that the government had replaced the carafe on 3 separate occasions without ever authorizing the purchase of a new machine. This was the government's consistent position on maintenance. Replace the component until there are no more components left, then and only then consider the machine. It was also the government's position on the septic line at the lower housing units and the crack in the access road retaining wall, and, increasingly, the question of whether rangers at Nora's grade and seniority deserved a cost of living adjustment. She got there before 6 most mornings. The drive from the housing units took 4 minutes, and the alternative was lying in the bunk listening to the quality of silence that a house makes when it has fewer people in it than it was built to hold. She poured the first pot before the others arrived and stood at the east-facing window with the mug warming her hands and watched the fog burn off the ridgeline. The sequoias stood up through it, their crowns catching the early light while the valley floor below stayed gray and soft and unhurried. She had watched this same sequence on hundreds of mornings, and it still did something to her chest she had never found the right word for. Some feelings are not improved by naming. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She did not look at it. She knew the sound. The bank app used it when her checking balance fell below $300, a threshold she had set 2 years ago when $300 felt like a reasonable warning line. Now $300 was a week of groceries and a full tank for the truck, and the notification went off 3 or 4 times a month, and she had long since stopped finding it useful. What it had become instead was something she could not quite call humiliation, but that lived in the same neighborhood. Marcus had left 18 months ago. The divorce itself had taken another 8 months, grinding through a calendar that seemed designed to extract whatever small reserves of energy and attention a person had left after the initial event. He had not been deliberately cruel about the leaving. He had sat across the kitchen table in the housing unit that Nora had spent 4 years making livable, and told her in a voice that was genuinely regretful that he had met someone in Visalia, that he had been somewhere else in his head for about 2 years, that he was sorry. He said sorry 9 times in that conversation. She counted without deciding to. What he had not mentioned in the kitchen, what she learned 6 months later through a credit check she was running to refinance the truck, was that the 2 years of being somewhere else in his head had been funded in specific and consequential ways. There were 3 credit cards she had never seen a statement for, a personal loan from a lender in Bakersfield, a timeshare arrangement that had represented a theory about investment that he had believed in briefly and then stopped believing in, while the obligation itself remained unchanged and continued accruing interest on its schedule regardless of anyone's beliefs. The total, when she first encountered it printed on a page at a gas station in Springville, was a number that made her sit down on the floor between the candy rack and the restroom door. The attendant came over. She waved him off. She sat there for a while reading the number again. Under California community property law, she was responsible for half of it. The law did not distinguish between debts you had known about and debts your spouse had assembled in a private financial life you had not known existed. It was a community debt, and she was half the community, and the number was the number. She had a payment schedule now. It was structured to pay the debt down in 7 years, which was responsible in a technical sense, and which also meant that for 7 years the end of every month looked like the kind of number that triggered a bank notification. The math did not leave room for much. It left room for groceries and the truck payment and Mia's school costs, and the small persistent expenses that make up the daily infrastructure of a life, and at the end of it there was usually somewhere between $40 and $200, and the bank app knew about it before she did. Her daughter Mia had turned 9 in March. She had Marcus's eyes, dark green that read as brown in low light, and his way of tilting her head slightly when she was working through a problem. Nora had spent the first year after he left being startled by these resemblances, and the year after that arriving at something closer to acceptance. Mia was not her father. She was her own person, and that person had a character that seemed to have arrived intact and early, a natural and genuine disposition toward fairness and toward noticing other people that Nora could not trace to any deliberate effort on her part. It was simply there, built in. On school mornings, Mia made her own lunch so Nora could sleep 20 extra minutes. She had started doing this at age 7 without being asked or instructed or rewarded for it. The first morning Nora came into the kitchen to find the sandwich already made. There was a note on the counter in the careful block letters of a 7-year-old that read, "There is coffee." There was no coffee. The machine had broken and Nora had forgotten to pick up a replacement. But the note was something more than its content, and they both understood that, even then. Mia spent Tuesdays and Wednesdays and every other weekend with her father in Visalia. She came back from those visits quieter sometimes, not unhappily, just processing. The apartment in Visalia had new appliances and a dog named Ringo that Mia loved, and a woman named Dana who was kind to Mia in a careful and deliberate way that Mia seemed to accept without much complication. Children have more capacity than adults generally give them credit for. Nora had noticed this and tried to let it guide her. On the nights when Mia came back from Visalia, there was a particular 15 minutes when the house changed temperature, not literally, but in some way that was just as real. Mia would come in and drop her bag and say hi without quite looking at Nora, not from coldness but from the slight recalibration of a child moving between two different atmospheres. And then somewhere around the time dinner was on the table, she would have finished that recalibration and be fully back, telling Nora about something that had happened at school, or about a book she was reading, or about something Ringo the dog had done that was stupid and funny. Nora had learned not to push the first 15 minutes. She had learned, in general, to let the transitions happen at whatever pace they needed to. Mia was reading above her grade level and was bad at math in a way that was so consistent it was probably a specific gap rather than a general weakness, and they had been working on it together on Tuesday evenings, the two of them at the kitchen table with worksheets and a bowl of pretzels, and progress was slow, but it was real. That was enough. Most of the things worth doing were slow. The rest of Mia's time was with Nora in the housing unit with the draft under the bathroom door and the refrigerator that hummed to itself at irregular intervals. 3 bedrooms, federal property, rented from the Park Service at the subsidized rate that had been in place since the mid-1970s to make it possible for ranger-grade employees to actually live in the communities where they worked rather than commuting 2 hours each way from the valley towns where housing was cheaper. Nora paid $420 a month. The same square footage in the nearest valley town would cost somewhere north of $1,600, and the gap between those numbers was the reason she was still here after Marcus left, still in the mountains, still able to manage. That gap was under administrative review. The new regional administrator had been looking at what he referred to in budget presentations as the full cost picture of employee services, and the housing subsidy appeared in that picture as a line item that looked, from Sacramento, like an opportunity for restructuring. Nora had heard about it the way she heard about most administrative developments at this level, through a chain of informal communication that traveled from the regional office to the superintendent's office to the division heads to the break room at Marble Fork, losing specificity at each step. What arrived at her level was the general shape of the thing. They were looking at restructuring the benefit, probably phased, probably starting with lower grades, and working up over 18 months. She had done the math on a trail count sheet one afternoon in February. At market rate, her monthly housing cost would increase by approximately $1,200. $1,200 a month, on top of the debt payments, on top of everything else that had a claim on a park ranger's salary in California in the current decade, produced a number on the wrong side of zero. She had looked at that number for about 2 minutes and then put the sheet in the recycling because some math problems do not have solutions, and looking at them longer does not change that. Dan Faraday came in at 6:30 with mud on his boots and the expression he wore when a task needed doing that nobody was going to enjoy. He was a large man who had been larger before 22 years of Sierra Nevada seasons took their toll, gray-bearded, careful in his movements, with the eyes of someone who was tired by disposition rather than circumstance. He had been managing this station since before Nora arrived, and he had a way of delivering difficult assignments that was so stripped of drama, it sometimes took her a moment to realize he had just handed her a full day of hard work. He poured the last of the first pot and turned to face her. "Callahan, I need you in Cathedral Grove today. Damage assessment and the anchor tree condition report." Cathedral Grove was in the southeastern quadrant of the monument, in a bowl-shaped valley that the surrounding terrain made difficult to reach from any direction. No maintained trail ran to it. No sign marked the approach. It appeared in the visitor-facing materials only as a notation that certain old-growth areas were restricted to authorized personnel, which was the Park Service's way of saying that if you did not already know how to get there, you were not expected to try. It was 7 miles from the nearest point where you could leave a vehicle, and most of those 7 miles were cross-country through terrain that changed character every quarter mile. The lightning strike had come 2 nights back, during a storm that moved through fast and hard. The overnight thermal flyover had picked up a residual hot spot in the Grove's vicinity, probably a smoldering root system, possibly nothing, but it needed eyes. Dan also wanted the annual condition check on the anchor trees, 8 designated specimens that had been monitored under a long-term research protocol since the 1960s, each one photographed and measured and noted every year for any change in the things that mattered: bark integrity, crown condition, structural soundness at the base. "I'll go," Nora said, and she said it without hesitation, because the alternative was a day of visitor contact hours and departmental paperwork, and what she needed more than either of those was 7 miles of country where her phone would not pick up a signal. She went back to the housing unit first, changed to the field boots with the better ankle support, packed her day kit, 3 liters of water, enough food for 8 hours, first aid, the handheld thermal sensor for the burn site, field notebook and pencils, the full-charge radio, her rain jacket regardless of the forecast, because she had been wet and cold out there before and knew better than to trust the sky in May regardless of what the weather service said. She was locking the truck cab when she saw it through the windshield. The glove compartment was open from where she had been looking for a pin earlier, and the morning sun was at an angle that lit the interior of the compartment, and the medallion caught the light and held it in a small warm disk on the inside of the door. She had been carrying it in the truck for 6 months, since the week after her grandmother's funeral. She had put it in the glove compartment when she got home that night, because she needed to put it somewhere, and the glove compartment was the nearest available place, and it had stayed there since without her deciding anything about it. Taking it inside felt like it would require her to decide something, to know what it meant or what to do with it, and she did not know either of those things. Her grandmother Eileen had pressed it into her hand 4 days before she died, in a hospital room in Fresno on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Eileen was 91 years old and weighed less than 100 pounds and had not lost a syllable of the East Tennessee accent she had brought to California when she was 17. She held Nora's hand with a grip that was stronger than it had any right to be and pressed the medallion into her palm and said, "This was Joseph's. You keep it now. You'll know when it matters." Nora had said, "Grandma, what do the symbols mean?" And Eileen had looked at her with the particular expression she used when a question was both understandable and somehow beside the point. "When you see them again," she said, "you'll know." She died 4 days later on a Tuesday morning, and Nora drove back to the monument in the dark with Mia asleep in the back seat and the medallion in her jacket pocket, and put it in the glove compartment when she got home because she was too tired to do anything else with it, and it had stayed there through the winter and into spring. Round, about the size of a silver dollar. Brass, gone warm from the sun through the glass. Both faces carried the same pattern, geometric and angular, and moving outward from a central point in a configuration that had the quality of logic without being immediately legible as any system Nora recognized. She had looked at it carefully the night her grandmother gave it to her, and had not arrived at an explanation. She had looked once at an antique collector's forum online where someone had told her it might be a surveyor's mark from the late 19th century, and she had not followed up on that either. She opened the compartment and took the medallion out and held it in her palm. It was warm from the sunlight and small and weighty in the particular way of old brass, and it was something of her grandmother's, and she was going to be alone in the mountains all day. She put it in the front pocket of her field pants and closed the truck and walked to the trailhead. The fire access road ended at a chain-link gate where a padlock chain crossed the vehicle track. Nora parked in the widened area before the gate, shouldered her pack, and came through the gap in the fence beside the gate post where someone long ago had bent the chain link back just enough to allow a person through if they turned sideways. The trailhead, if it deserved that name, was a thinning in the vegetation on the far side. The first half-mile was through mixed pine and white fir, open and easy, the ground well-drained, and the footing solid from last summer's drought-hardened soil. Then the forest changed. It changed the way it always did out here, not gradually, but in a transition that felt like crossing a threshold, the understory opening as the canopy closed, the dominant species shifting from pine to sequoia in a way that was less a gradient than a declaration. The trees were simply different now, older, larger in a way that went past size into something else, something that had to do with time more than measurement. She moved at her working pace, steady and unhurried, eyes moving between the ground and the mid-canopy. She was logging damage as she went, not just looking for the burn site, but noting everything the storm had done. A section of trail where runoff had cut a channel across the line of travel, 6 inches deep and 3 feet across. A place where the soil had saturated and a shallow-rooted pine had listed 7 or 8 degrees off vertical. She marked both on the GPS. At half a mile, she found the first significant damage. A ponderosa pine down across the approach line, fully across. The root ball ripped from the earth, and the pit left. Behind, measuring roughly 6 feet across and 4 deep, the soil around it still displaced and raw. She marked it on her map and GPS, noted the condition of the surrounding trees for any sign of root disease that might have contributed to the failure, found none, and went around the fallen tree on the uphill side where the crown had not reached. The next mile and a half was slower going. The storm had moved debris across the forest floor in ways that required attention, and she stopped 4 more times to photograph and log smaller-scale damage. Her mind was working in the background the way it did out here, parallel to the active task, running its own quieter program. She thought about the housing meeting that Dan had mentioned was scheduled for next month. She thought about Mia, who had a class project due on Friday that she had not started yet, and about which she was currently maintaining a position of confident denial. She thought about what she was going to make for dinner, and remembered that the refrigerator was low and she needed to go to the store, and that going to the store meant another hour of the day gone, another hour that she was not quite sure where to fit. She thought about the medallion in her pocket without meaning to. It was just there, present, the way her grandmother was present still in a general low-level way in the months after the funeral, not grief exactly, not the sharp thing, but a background awareness that someone who had been a fixed point in the world was no longer fixed there. Eileen had been born in Tennessee in 1932 and had grown up in a house without running water and had left at 17 on a bus to California with $40 and the address of a cousin in Fresno who may or may not have been expecting her. She had married at 22, worked in canneries and then in a school kitchen and then as a seamstress for a dry goods store on the edge of Fresno's downtown, and had outlived her husband by 19 years and her generation's expectation of what a woman could accomplish and care for. She had kept the medallion for as long as anyone in the family could remember, and when asked about it had given answers that were consistent in the sense of always being the same general shape of not quite answer. It had been Joseph's. It was important. Someone in the family would know what to do with it at the right time. Joseph Callahan, by family account, was a serious man who had walked the Sierra Nevada for 30 years and found it larger than he had expected. He had come looking for gold, in the general sense that everyone who arrived in the California mountains in the second half of the 19th century had come looking for gold, and had found instead a career as a surveyor's assistant, and then as an independent timber surveyor, because the mountains held something more reliable than gold in that period, which was timber, and the logging companies needed men who could walk old-growth country and tell them what was there. He had been good at it. He had spent seasons in country very much like the country Nora was walking now, mapping it, measuring it, learning it in the way that comes from covering the same ground over years rather than days. Somewhere in that time, he had found something. The family stories were consistent on this point and vague on every other. Something extraordinary, something he had not spoken of directly, something that had changed the character of his later years from a man who was fully present to a man who was present in the room but thinking about something else. His wife had said to her daughter, who had said to hers, that he had put something somewhere safe and was waiting for it to be found again when the time was right. He had died in 1923 without saying, or at least without saying to anyone who wrote it down, what that something was or where he had put it. At 2 miles, she hit the first drainage crossing. The creek was running much higher than any May level she had seen in 12 years of coming this way, the storm having pushed the watershed past its usual spring volume, and the water came to mid-shin at the ford and moved with enough force that she chose each step with deliberate care. The cold came through her boots completely and occupied every bit of her attention for the 30 seconds it took to cross and scramble up the far bank. Then she was moving and the cold started working its way back out, and in 5 minutes her feet were warm again. The burn site was at 3.5 miles, in a gap between a cluster of pines where the lightning had struck the ground and the ignition had spread outward through the accumulated needle litter and duff before the moisture in the surrounding soil smothered it. The burn circle was roughly 8 feet across, irregular at the edges where the fuel density had varied. She crouched and ran the thermal sensor across it in a slow grid. The reading came back as warm, residual heat from the duff rather than any active combustion, roughly 48 hours from completely cold at the rate it was dissipating. No risk. She photographed the site from 4 angles, logged the GPS coordinates, noted the condition of the nearest standing trees, and kept moving. The sky by now was fully clear, the May sun doing what it does at these elevations, more direct and immediate than the valley sun, the atmosphere thinner and less forgiving. She stopped on a south-facing granite shelf to eat half a bar and drink and look out at the range to the east, where the high peaks still carried their winter snowpack in the couloirs and north faces. She had grown up in Sacramento, in a house on a street with elm trees and a neighbor who played music too loud on Saturday mornings, and she had come up here for the first time on a college field course and had not really left. Some landscapes claim people. This one had claimed her. She put the bar wrapper in her pack and kept moving. Cathedral Grove announced itself by feeling before it announced itself by sight. The temperature dropped 2 degrees in what felt like a single step. The sounds changed quality, the wind that had been audible through the mixed forest now gone entirely at ground level, absorbed by the mass of the old growth ahead. And then the trees were simply there, enormous in a way that the word enormous does not actually describe, present in a way that made the country she had just walked through feel preliminary. The first anchor tree she reached was GSM 2219, Big Harold, documented at 247 feet tall and 24 feet and 8 inches in diameter at the base, measurements taken in 2019 as part of the long-term monitoring protocol. She had those numbers in her field notebook. Standing at Harold's base, looking up at the bark that ran red-brown and deeply furrowed from the ground to somewhere far above the useful range of her vision, the numbers were a different kind of information entirely. They were accurate, and they were also inadequate in a way that was not the numbers' fault. She walked the anchor tree circuit in the established order, working clockwise around the grove. GSM 2219 showed minor storm damage, scattered branch falls within a 100-foot radius, nothing that indicated any change in the tree's structural condition. GSM 2220 and 2221, the sisters, 2 trees that had grown so close for so long that their base structures had merged in a continuous plate of root and bark, were clean. GSM 2222 showed a small section of bark loss on the southwest face that was consistent with a glancing strike from a falling branch. She photographed it and noted it was superficial. GSM 2223 and 2224 were undamaged. GSM 2225, known as Widowmaker for the weight and spread of its crown rather than any documented incident, had dropped 2 major branches in the storm winds, each of them perhaps 12 feet long and 8 inches thick at the failure point, and she spent 15 minutes examining the branch scars for any sign that decay had contributed to the failure. She found none. The tree had shed weight in response to stress, which was what healthy trees did, and the scars would callous over the growing season. She photographed them and moved on, standing at the base of GSM 2225 for those 15 minutes, working her way methodically around the scarred wood with her flashlight even in full daylight because the bark texture made shadows that mimicked decay. She thought about scale in a way she often thought about it in this grove. The branch that had failed was 8 inches in diameter at the break point. In any forest she had known before coming here, that would be a significant log, a thing worth noting. In this grove it was litter. It was the forest equivalent of losing a fingernail. The tree would not register it as loss. This was what the grove did to your perception of proportion. It recalibrated you. A thing that was large everywhere else was small here, and the smallness was not diminishment, but rather context, a more accurate sense of where you stood in relation to the long work of time. Nora had been coming to Cathedral Grove for 12 years, and it still did this to her, still reset her internal scale in a way that she found, despite everything else, settling. The debt and the housing review and the bank notification and the spreadsheet on the trail count sheet were real. They were also, at some level that was hard to articulate without sounding like a fortune cookie, a fraction of the size they felt in the housing unit at 6 in the morning. GSNM 4471 was last. The grandmother. She had always been last, partly because the circuit route ended at her, and partly because of something else that Nora had never articulated to anyone and would have been embarrassed to try. You saved her for last the way you saved the best thing on the plate. She was the oldest living thing in the monument. The Park Service's best estimate, derived from core samples and surface analysis and comparison with regional dendrochronological records, placed her age at somewhere between 2,600 and 2,800 years, with the midpoint estimate at 2,700. Nora had thought about that number carefully more than once, tried to hold it against other numbers as a way of understanding it. 2,700 years ago, the Etruscan civilization was at its height. The Buddha was teaching in northern India. Rome was a city of 100,000 people that had not yet decided it was an empire. The Parthenon would not be built for another 200 years. And in a bowl in the Sierra Nevada, a seed had landed in decomposed granite, and something had started. She came around the south side of the knoll where the grandmother stood and stopped walking. The ground on the north side of the tree was wrong. It took her a moment to understand why, because she had an expectation based on previous visits, and what she was seeing did not match that expectation. The accumulated material around the north face of the tree's base was gone. Not all of it, not everywhere, but on the north side, where two massive surface roots fanned outward and the terrain between them created a natural channel. The storm's runoff had cut through years of accumulated forest floor and taken it downslope. The erosion was dramatic, exposing root bark that had not seen light in a long time, pale where the rest of the bark was dark, and at the base of the tree, in the space between the two outermost roots, there was a gap that had not been visible on any previous visit. Nora walked around the root structure carefully. The excavation was larger than it first appeared from 20 feet away. The water had come through with real force and removed perhaps 3 to 4 feet of accumulated needle litter, decomposed bark, and old soil, material that had been building up at this tree's base for as long as anyone had records, which went back to the 1960s. Before that, presumably, for considerably longer. The gap between the two surface roots was roughly 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, defined at its edges by the curves of the root faces on either side. Through the gap, the interior of the hollow was dark, and the air coming out of it was cool and carried the scent of old wood and something she could not immediately identify, something dry and enclosed, the smell of a space that had been sealed from the surrounding air for a very long time. The park records on GSNM 4471 noted the presence of an interior hollow. Most sequoias of extreme age have them, the heartwood having died centuries back, leaving a shell of living sapwood. The grandmother's hollow was documented. She had seen the notation, estimated interior cavity 8 to 12 feet in diameter, no documented entry point, cavity, ceiling height, unknown. Those words, no documented entry point, had been in the records since the 1980s. Nobody had been inside, or if they had not put it in the record. She unclipped her flashlight and crouched at the gap and shone the beam inside. The space was considerably larger than the entry gap suggested. She could see that immediately, wide enough that a person could stand comfortably without touching the walls, with room to move in most directions. The ceiling rose into darkness that the flashlight beam did not fully reach. The floor was formed by the root structure, irregular but solid, coated with dry debris that the surrounding material had protected from the rain. The walls curved inward as they rose. The dark wood of the heartwood scored with the texture of centuries of slow change, grain lines running in subtle patterns that were the record of 1,000 growing seasons. She moved the beam slowly across the interior. Left wall, ceiling, right wall, floor. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. And then she held the beam on the far side of the hollow, and she stopped moving it, and she stayed very still. On the far side of the hollow, set into the inner wall of the tree at a point roughly 10 feet from where she crouched, was a door. She stayed at the gap for what was probably 2 full minutes, not moving, not adjusting the flashlight, just looking. She was waiting for the door to resolve into something else, into a section of bark with an unusual grain, into a natural crack in the wood that the beam was interpreting as straight lines, into anything that was not a door. It did not resolve into anything else. It was a door, iron, man-made, set into the curved wood of the hollow's interior wall at a slight angle that suggested it had been fitted to the curve rather than installed without regard for it. It was approximately 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, arched at the top. The iron was dark and old and the surface was pitted in places, and it had a ring handle on the right side mounted to a plate, and around the edges of the door there was a frame of slightly different metal, slightly darker, pressed flush against the inner wood. Nora pulled off her pack and pushed it through the gap ahead of her, and then worked her own way through on hands and knees, turning sideways to clear the roots, and stood up inside the hollow. The interior was larger standing up than it had appeared from the outside. She had this thought every time she entered a Sequoia Hollow, the dissonance between the outside dimensions and the inside experience. The walls curved away from her in all directions, rising and narrowing toward a ceiling she could not quite reach with the flashlight beam at 60 feet, the hollow tapering as the trees living would closed above. The floor was uneven but workable, the root structure creating a kind of irregular surface with accumulated dry material filling the gaps. She stood still for a moment and let her eyes adjust and let the space settle into her sense of where she was. The sound from outside was muffled but present, the grove continuing its work. Inside, the air was the coolest she had felt all day, stable in the way of spaces that do not exchange much with the outer atmosphere, and it had that particular dry quality she had noticed from the gap, old and enclosed and very still. She swept the flashlight around the interior more carefully now that she was standing in it. The floor, checking for any animal sign. Nothing. The walls, looking for any structural concern in the heartwood that might indicate the hollow was enlarging in a way that could eventually compromise the tree's structural integrity. The heartwood was dead, as it would be, but the surrounding sapwood was clearly alive, the walls of the hollow springy rather than brittle when she pressed a gloved hand against them. The tree was fine. The tree would outlast every concern she had about it. Then she crossed to the door. 3 long steps, 4, across the floor of a tree that had been alive since before the Roman Empire. She raised the flashlight close to the iron surface and moved the beam slowly across it. The metal was structurally intact in a way she did not understand. Any iron exposed to Sierra Nevada conditions for 100 years should have oxidized past the point of integrity, should have been rough and fragile and returning to its components. This was not that. It was darkened, yes, the surface bearing the patina of great age, but it was whole. She pressed her gloved palm flat against it and felt the cold mass of solid metal. Not soft, not compromised. Whole and cold and real. The ring handle was iron of the same dark type, fixed to a mounting plate by means she could not see from the outside. The mounting plate was surrounded by a mechanism she did not recognize from any lock system she had encountered, a set of small iron components arranged around the plate in an interleaved configuration that suggested movement was built into the design. It was not a padlock. It was not a standard latch or bolt arrangement. It was its own thing, specific and old and purposeful. Above the ring, at eye level, the surface of the door had been worked. Symbols cut directly into the iron. Not painted or applied, but carved in, the edges of each mark precise and deliberate. They were geometric, angular, arranged in a pattern that moved from a central form outward in a sequence that was internally consistent, each element relating to those around it in a logic she could sense without being able to articulate. She held the beam on them and moved it slowly, trying to read them the way you read something in an unfamiliar alphabet, looking for the organizing principle. She had seen this before. The recognition arrived in her body before it arrived in her mind. Her right hand moved to the pocket of her field pants and took out the medallion before she had fully connected the sensation to the thought. She held the medallion beside the door and moved the flashlight between them. The symbols matched. She checked this slowly and carefully, moving the beam from the medallion to the door and back, comparing each element. Not similar in style or approximate in character. Identical, specific, each angle replicated, each geometric form corresponding exactly to its counterpart. The pattern on the medallion was the central section of the larger pattern on the door, nested inside the larger design the way a detailed photograph contains the whole of the original, compressed but complete. Her hand was shaking. She pressed it flat against her leg until it steadied and looked at the medallion and looked at the door and thought about Joseph Callahan, who had come to California from Missouri in 1876 and spent 30 years walking the Sierra Nevada as a timber surveyor, and who had found something he would not speak of directly, and who had spent his last years with the particular quiet. According to his wife, and then his wife's daughter, and then her daughter, and finally Eileen, of a man who had put something somewhere safe and was waiting, without urgency, for the right time. Eileen at 91, pressing the medallion into Nora's hand in a hospital room. You'll know when it matters. Nora held the medallion against the symbols on the door, pressing the face of it flat against the iron, the brass warm against the cold metal. Nothing moved. She angled the medallion, tried a different orientation, moved it 10 degrees, and then 15. Tried a third orientation. The center of the medallion's pattern aligned with what she judged to be the center of the door's pattern. On the third adjustment, two of the iron components in the mechanism around the ring handle shifted. It was subtle, a small lateral movement, a sound like something dry finding clearance it had not had access to for a very long time. She held the medallion in place and heard, from somewhere behind the iron, a sequence of smaller sounds, fine and careful, moving through some internal logic she was not part of but was witnessing. Things that had been in one position for an extremely long time moving to another. She held still. She did not breathe. The ring handle, which had been flush against the door's surface, now showed a gap. Thin as a folded piece of paper, almost nothing, but there. The door had not opened. But something inside it had changed, some arrangement of components having moved from one state toward another. The way a combination lock feels different after the first number falls even before you have turned it to the second. Nora stepped back. She needed to see it from a small distance. She needed to breathe and think rather than just feel, because the feeling was loud right now and not particularly useful. She stood in the dark interior of a tree that had been alive for 27 centuries, in a grove that 7 miles of unmarked mountains separated from the nearest paved road, and she looked at an iron door that was breathing. That was the only word for it. The thin gap around the ring plate carried a faint movement of air, the first movement this space had allowed in however long it had been sealed, something vast, and still beginning very slowly to become not still. Joseph Callahan had walked these mountains from 1876 until somewhere in the early 1900s. The family stories placed him in the high country for years, logging company work, but also his own explorations. A man who found the Sierra Nevada interesting in the way some people find something interesting enough to give their life to it. He had found something extraordinary, the stories said. He had found something he would not speak of directly. He had spent the last years of his life with the quiet of a man who was waiting. He had given his wife the medallion, and she had kept it and given it to her daughter, and she had kept it and given it to Eileen, and Eileen had kept it for 50 years and pressed it into Nora's hand with the words, "You'll know when it matters," and the instruction, "You'll know when you see them again." Outside the hollow, through the gap between the surface roots, Nora could hear the grove. Wind moving through the crowns of the sequoias, 300 feet overhead. A stellar's jay calling somewhere nearby. The distant sound of the creek still running high from the storm. Everything was normal. Everything out there was the forest being the forest, the same forest she had walked for 12 years, doing what it did without any reference to what was happening inside this tree. Inside the hollow, the gap around the ring handle held its thin line of darkness, and the air that came through it was old and dry and had been waiting for longer than anyone currently alive had been alive. Nora stood in the silence and looked at the door and held the medallion and understood, with a clarity she was not quite prepared for, that she was standing in front of an answer to a question she had not known she was asking. Whatever Joseph Callahan had placed behind this door, whatever had been worth building a sealed vault inside a living tree to protect, whatever had made him spend his final years in a particular and patient silence, it had been here in the dark of this hollow. For more than 100 years. Through 2 world wars, and the Depression, and the post-war years, and the decades after that. Through the entire span of her family's life in California. Through her grandmother's long life, all 91 years of it. She thought about Eileen in that hospital room. The grip that was stronger than it had any right to be. The expression she had used when Nora asked about the symbols. Not evasive, not mysterious for the sake of it, but the expression of someone who knows that certain things can only be understood from the inside, that you cannot explain a door to someone who has not yet stood in front of it. She thought about Mia, 9 years old, making her own lunch in the morning in a kitchen with a humming refrigerator in a housing unit that might not be available to them in 18 months. She thought about the bank notification she had not looked at this morning. She thought about the trail count sheet with the math that had no solution. Whatever was behind this door, it had been placed there by someone in her family line, sealed there with a mechanism that only someone carrying her grandmother's medallion could begin to open. Joseph Callahan had not walked into these mountains and stumbled across something. He had walked in here with a purpose, and he had done something with that purpose, and he had spent the rest of his life waiting for the right person to come back for it. She had thought, in the 18 months since Marcus left, that the central problem of her life was financial. The debt, the housing, the math that did not work, those were the problems she lay awake with, the ones that produced the bank notifications and the trail count sheet and the calculations she had run and then put in the recycling. She had been wrong about what the central problem was, or at least about what the central shape of things was. The financial problem was real and it needed solving, but it was not the whole picture. The whole picture included a brass medallion passed down through 4 generations of women, and a man named Joseph Callahan who had walked into these mountains 150 years ago and found something extraordinary, and a door set into the interior of a tree that had been alive since before the birth of civilization as the Western world organized the concept, and a mechanism that had just moved for the first time in longer than any living person's memory. Nora placed the medallion against the symbols one more time, holding it steady in the 3rd orientation, and listened. From behind the iron, the dry, careful sequence of sounds continued. Not rushing. Working through what they were designed to work through. Taking their time, because whatever had designed this had not been in a hurry, had been thinking in decades rather than days. And the patience built into the mechanism was the patience of someone who had understood that the right person would come eventually and had therefore built something that could wait. The gap around the ring handle was a little wider now. A fraction more. Enough that the air coming through it was perceptibly cooler than the air of the hollow. The temperature differential between whatever was on the other side of the door and the air of the tree's interior registering against her face as the faintest breath of something very old and very still. She stood in the dark interior of a tree that had been alive for 27 centuries and let the coolness touch her face and held still and waited for whatever was next. The sequence of sounds behind the iron door lasted 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Nora knew this because she looked at her watch when the sounds stopped and calculated backward to when she had placed the medallion against the symbols for the 3rd time, and the number she arrived at was 4 minutes and 22 seconds of small, careful movements working their way through a mechanism that had been still for longer than anyone living could remember. During those 4 minutes, she did not move. She stood at the door with the medallion pressed against the iron and listened to the sounds and let them happen, the way you let a fire build before you add fuel, the way you wait in the field for an animal to settle before you move closer. She had spent 12 years in work that required patience at the specific scale of natural systems, the patience of watching rather than acting, and it was that patience more than anything else that kept her still now when everything else in her was doing the opposite of still. When the final sound came, it was different from the others. Not a click or a shift, but something lower, a note more felt than heard. The whole door settling into a new position the way a very large thing settles when it is finally at rest. And then nothing. Silence. The gap around the ring handle, which had been widening in increments too small to track in real time, was now perhaps a quarter inch, and the air coming through it was cool and steady and smelled of stone. Nora reached for the ring handle and stopped with her hand a foot from the iron. She had been standing in this hollow for the better part of 20 minutes, and she had not yet called Dan or logged any of what she had found or told a single person in the world that she was inside this tree looking at a door that had just opened itself in response to a brass medallion her dead grandmother had kept for 50 years. She was a federal employee on an official damage assessment in a restricted area of a national monument, and what she was about to do was open a sealed structure of unknown origin without authorization or support or any real plan beyond the fact that it was here, and she was here, and the door was already telling her it was willing. She gripped the ring. The door moved on the first pull. Not easily, not like a well-oiled modern hinge, but with the deliberate resistance of something that has been in one position for a very long time and is now being asked to be in another. The iron was heavy and the resistance was real. She pulled steadily, keeping her weight back, and the door came outward on hinges she had not been able to see from the outside, swinging in a long, slow arc that traced a half circle across the root floor. Behind it was darkness. She raised the flashlight. The beam went into the darkness and did not find a wall immediately, and that was the first indication that whatever was back there was larger than the door had suggested. She had expected a small cavity, a personal-scale hiding place, something in proportion to the opening. What she was looking at instead was the beginning of a passage, iron-framed like the door, cut into solid granite. The walls rough-dressed in the way of work done by hand tools rather than machine, and it ran back and to the left in a direction that was away from the tree's center and into the rock of the knoll itself. She stood at the threshold and breathed the air that came out of the passage. It was cold and very dry, noticeably drier than the hollow behind her or the grove outside. There was no smell of decay, no organic note of rot or mildew or the slow decomposition that happens when organic material meets moisture over time. The air smelled of granite. Old granite, mineral and clean, the smell of stone that has been insulated from the surface world. She checked the radio on her belt. She was 7 miles from Dan with a mountain range's worth of rock between her and the nearest repeater station. The radio would not reach anyone from inside a granite formation. She knew this without testing it. She had worked enough backcountry assignments to know where coverage ended, and it ended here. She had 2 choices. Go back out, climb to a ridgeline high enough to reach the repeater, call Dan, and come back with people. Or go in. She went in. The passage was perhaps 12 feet long, the walls close enough that she could touch both sides with her arms extended. The ceiling cut to a height that required her to duck once at a natural irregularity in the stone where the work had navigated around a harder section of granite that the tool had gone around rather than through. The floor was level, deliberately leveled, and the surface underfoot was stone that had been smoothed by hand or by a tool that left curved marks she could see in the flashlight beam. The whole passage was the work of a person who knew what they were doing and had taken their time. Then it opened. Nora stepped through the opening and stopped, and the flashlight beam moved across the space in front of her in a slow sweep that she ran twice before she trusted what she was seeing. The chamber was roughly 20 feet wide and 18 feet deep, with a ceiling that had been cut to 8 feet and finished in a way that left the granite smooth enough to not catch on a tall person's hair. The walls were dressed stone, the same rough-hand technique as the passage, but the work inside the chamber was more careful, the surfaces more even. At the chamber's corners, the The stonework had been finished with particular attention, the angles squared and the edges chamfered in a way that showed a craftsmanship that went beyond mere function. Iron had been set into the walls at regular intervals, forming shelves, 8 of them along the left wall and 6 along the right. Each shelf maybe 2 feet deep and constructed with the same dark iron as the door. On every shelf, arranged with the systematic order of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time, were objects. The quality of the air was something she kept noticing. She had been in caves before, several times in the course of her work, and caves had a smell that was consistent, mineral, and slightly wet, the smell of water working through rock over geological time. This chamber did not smell like that. It smelled of dry stone and of the materials stored in it, the old leather of the cylinder wrappings, the faint metallic note of iron, something organic and faint that might have been the original sawdust packing in the crates. No moisture, no decay. The climate in here had been stable, dry and cool, for however long the chamber had existed, and whatever Joseph had understood about the thermal properties of granite at this depth had been correct. On the floor, arranged in a row down the center of the chamber, stood 3 large iron-bound chests. The wood of the chests was old, the surface gray and compressed with age, but the iron bands around them were the same preserved dark metal as everything else in here, the same improbable solidity, holding the wood tight and sealed. Each chest was maybe 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, 2 feet tall. On the left wall shelves were wooden crates, smaller than the chests, sealed with iron clips that had been bent over the lids. There were perhaps 30 of them, varying slightly in size. On the right wall shelves were different shapes, rolled leather cylinders, each one bound with iron wire, perhaps 40 of them in groups of 4 or 5, flat wooden boxes a foot square and a few inches deep, and at the far end of the right wall, a single object that was different from everything else. It was a writing desk, small, iron-framed, with a stone top, and on the desk, preserved under a flat piece of iron that had been laid over it like a lid, was a leather-wrapped bundle. Nora made herself look at the whole room before she touched anything. She moved the flashlight methodically, shelf by shelf, chest by chest, and she tried to be a professional, a ranger doing an assessment, a person who recorded before she disturbed. She took her field notebook from her pack and wrote the date and time and GSM. 4471 interior chamber, and then she wrote what she saw, the counts and the dimensions and the arrangement, and she kept her hands from touching anything for the time it took to fill 2 pages. Then she went to the nearest shelf and opened the first crate. The iron clips bent back with pressure. The lid lifted. Inside, packed in what had once been sawdust, but was now a fine dry powder, were coins. She picked one up and held the flashlight close to it and read the stamp. $20. The image was a Liberty head, facing left, the kind of stamp she recognized from the reference books at the ranger station that covered period artifacts found in the monument. The date below the Liberty head read 1879. She turned the coin over. On the reverse, the eagle and the denomination and the words United States of America pressed into the gold with a clarity that told her this was not a reproduction. It was too heavy, the color too specific, the edge milled in the way that real gold coins of that period were milled. She set it down carefully and counted the coins in the top layer of the first crate. 40. She moved the sawdust powder and felt the coins beneath. The crate was full, maybe 4 or 5 layers deep. 150 to 200 coins per crate. She picked up a second coin from a different position in the crate, not from the top layer, but from below, pushed out from the side. Examined it. The date on this one was 1881. The mint mark was a small letter below the date. San Francisco Mint. She knew enough from the monument's interpretive materials about gold rush history to know that San Francisco mint coins from this period in this condition were collector items, that numismatists paid multiples of gold melt value for them, that a high-grade specimen from a closed mint could command prices that had nothing to do with the weight of metal in your hand. She set it back. There were 30 crates on the shelves, plus 3 iron-bound chests on the floor. She went to the nearest chest and found the latch, a simple iron bar that lifted. The lid was heavy but balanced on its hinge and came up without much effort. She held the flashlight over the opening and looked inside. The chest was full of raw gold. Not coins, not processed material, but placer gold in its natural form, the irregular lumps and flakes and small rounded pieces that formed in alluvial deposits over millions of years of water moving through fractured rock. It was packed into the chest without any separation or ordering, just the raw mineral filling the space from bottom to lid. She pressed her hand into the top layer, and the gold shifted around her fingers with a weight that was different from any other material she had handled, a density that was not quite right for its apparent volume, too heavy for how much space it occupied. She could not calculate the value in her head. She did not have the numbers available. What she knew was that gold traded at over $3,000 an ounce, that a troy ounce of gold was slightly less than an ounce by conventional measure, and that the chest in front of her held considerably more than a few ounces. The chest was 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, and about 2 feet of interior depth, and it was full. There were 3 chests. She stood at the open chest, and let the flashlight beam rest on the gold, and tried to make her mind work properly. She was a park ranger who made $53,000 a year. She had never been in the same room with serious money. The most expensive single thing she owned was the truck, which she owed $4,000 on. The number in the chest in front of her did not connect to any framework her experience had given her for thinking about value. She closed the chest. She needed to do this systematically. She went to the writing desk and the leather-wrapped bundle. The iron plate covering it lifted away easily. The leather was stiff with age but had not cracked, the wrapping intact. She opened it carefully, working the ties loose without pulling hard, setting each tie aside as it came free. Inside was a journal. The cover was pressed leather, dark brown gone almost black, with a simple design tooled into the front surface. A circle with geometric markings around its edge, the same markings as the medallion. She opened the cover. The first page was a date, September 3rd, 1879, and below it, in handwriting that was careful and clear and slightly formal in the way of educated men of that period who had been taught penmanship as a discipline, a line. If you are reading this, then someone from my family has found the door. I am glad. Nora sat down on the stone floor of the chamber with her back against the iron shelving and read Joseph Callahan's journal from the beginning. He had come to the Sierra Nevada in the spring of 1877 as a junior member of a survey team contracted by the Sierra Timber Corporation to map old-growth timber holdings in the eastern portion of what was then the Tulare County forest land. He was 23 years old and had been working in Missouri as a draftsman and had answered a newspaper advertisement for experienced surveyors willing to work remote country in California, the pay being better than what he was making and the location being somewhere he had always wanted to see. He described the mountains in the first entries with the precise enthusiasm of a man who was seeing something for the first time that he recognized, not from prior experience, but from some internal category he had carried without knowing it. The trees were not like anything he had seen or been told about. They were old in a way that changed the quality of time around them, that made a person feel, standing among them, that the decades they measured their own life by were a different unit of measurement from the one the trees used, and that both were valid and neither was better, just different scales for different purposes. He worked the survey for 2 seasons, walking the timber company's claimed land and recording species counts and board-foot estimates and terrain features. In the spring of 1879, during a solo reconnaissance of a high valley on the eastern edge of the survey area, he followed a creek into a granite formation and found a place where a landslide from the previous winter had exposed the base of a cliff face that the creek had been running against for, he estimated, a very long time. The exposure was a cave entrance, roughly 4 feet wide and 8 feet tall, partially blocked by the debris of the slide. He cleared enough of the debris to get through and went in. He described what he found inside in measured language that was clearly the language of a man trying to be accurate rather than dramatic. The cave was an alluvial deposit formation, a natural cavity that had formed over an extremely long geological period as water moved through fractured granite and concentrated the heavier minerals that traveled with it. What had concentrated in this cavity, over a geological period he could not estimate precisely, but understood to be very long, was gold. Not in the quantities of a minor placer deposit, not in the scattered flakes and occasional nuggets that prospectors panned from Sierra creeks, but in the quantities of a primary lode formation, a deposit so large and so concentrated that he stood in the cave entrance for a long time before he was able to complete a second coherent thought after the first one. which was simply that he had found something that should not be possible to find. He went back to camp and said nothing. He had thought about it for 2 weeks before deciding what to do. The land the cave was on was technically claimed by the timber company as part of their survey area, though the claim was for timber rights, not mineral rights, and the legal situation was not entirely clear even to him. What was clear was that if he reported the deposit, it would belong to men who had hired him for $50 a month to walk their land and count trees, and who had made that money available to themselves through a combination of political connections and the kind of land-grant arrangements that had, in his observation, never benefited anyone who actually lived in the mountains or worked in them. He wrote about this without bitterness. He was not by nature a bitter man. He was a practical man who looked at a situation and tried to understand the likely outcomes of different choices. The likely outcome of reporting the deposit was that it would be claimed, mined, and stripped, and the money would go to men in San Francisco and Sacramento, and the cave and the country around it would be left in the state that all mined-out country was left in, which was considerably worse than it had started. The Sierra Nevada was full of places that looked like this, the hydraulic mining scars and the foothills visible for miles, the rivers running gray with sediment, the fish gone. He had seen enough of that country to know what he did not want to be responsible for. He wrote, "I did not choose to find this. I did not plan to be in that valley on that day. The creek led me to it, and the slide exposed it, and I walked in. I believe a man has some claim on the thing he finds when no other man was looking for it, and I believe the country has an equal claim to not being destroyed in the finding. My plan satisfies both. I take only what I need to take. I take it quietly. I leave what I cannot take without destroying the taking of it. And I give what remains to the ones who come after me, who will be in a better position to decide than I am, because they will live in a different world, and the world will have taught them different things." He stayed in the Sierra Nevada for the next 12 years. He maintained his cover as an independent timber surveyor, taking contracts from various companies that kept him in the mountains and gave him legitimate reason to be in remote country with tools and a mule. He worked the cave deposit in the late season each year, after the survey contracts were done and the mountains were beginning to empty of other workers before winter. He recorded everything, every extraction, every weight, every year. The journal contained 40 pages of meticulous records, the numbers in columns, the dates in sequence, the running total updated at the end of each season. Nora ran her finger down the final column of the final page of records. The number at the bottom was in pounds. 2,347 pounds of raw placer gold extracted over 11 working seasons between 1879 and 1890, plus an additional weight of processed coins he had purchased over the same period with cash drawn against small amounts of gold he had sold through brokers in San Francisco, establishing a pattern of modest sales that fit the profile of a working prospector with a minor claim. The coins represented a conversion of value into a form that was easier to store and carry and eventually to use. She did not have a calculator. She worked the math in her head at the rough level first. 2,347 pounds of raw gold. There were approximately 14.58 troy ounces in a pound. So 2,347 pounds was approximately 34,000 troy ounces of raw gold. At $3,200 per troy ounce, which was the figure she could remember from a news story she had read earlier in the year, 34,000 troy ounces was a number that began with 100 and ended with 8 zeros. And when she ran that multiplication out to its conclusion and sat with the result for a moment, she put the journal down on her knee and looked at the ceiling of the chamber and breathed slowly and deliberately for about 15 seconds. The raw gold alone, at current market prices, was worth somewhere between $108 million and $115 million, depending on purity. She did not know the purity of alluvial gold from this particular deposit. Alluvial gold was typically high purity, often above 90%, and the closer to pure the higher the price per ounce. She was using a conservative estimate. The real number was likely higher. The coins were additional. She had counted 30 crates, 150 to 200 coins per crate, each coin a gold double eagle in various states of preservation. Coin appraisal was not her field. She knew the melt value of a $20 gold piece was roughly $1,500 at current prices, which put a crate of 175 coins at melt value somewhere around $262,000, and 30 crates at just under $8 million in melt value alone. But numismatic premiums on coins of this period, particularly high-grade San Francisco mint specimens, could be 3 to 5 times the melt value, and some individual dates and mint marks could be multiples above that. She was not going to guess at numismatic value. She was going to say the coins added something in the range of $8 million to $40 million to the total, acknowledge that she did not know, and move on. $108 million to $115 million in raw gold. $8 million to $40 million in historical coins. A total range, on the conservative end, of somewhere around $120 million, and on a more realistic end somewhere closer to $150 million to $180 million. And she had not yet looked at the other leather cylinders or the flat wooden boxes on the right-hand shelves, and she had not yet found the map. She went to the flat wooden boxes on the lower right shelf. 11 of them, each sealed with a small iron clip. She opened the nearest one and found documents inside, folded papers preserved in the same dry stillness that had kept everything else intact. Land filings, mineral rights claims, signed and dated in the years between 1879 and 1890. In Joseph's hand, and in names she did not recognize, filed on parcels whose legal descriptions she could not immediately place, but that the language of the documents put in the eastern Sierra Nevada. He had not been improvising. He had been building a legal architecture one quiet document at a time, filing papers through brokers and county offices in the way a careful man files things, without drawing attention, in amounts and at intervals that would not cause anyone to look twice. She did not open more of the boxes. What she understood was that Joseph had been trying to give his family something to stand on when the time came. Not just gold, but a documented claim structure, something that was more than a room full of metal in a mountain. She put the box back and sat on the stone floor of a chamber inside a mountain and thought about her debt, which was $47,300 currently. Give or take the most recent payment. She thought about it specifically and deliberately because she needed to hold the size of what was in this room against something concrete to understand what she was looking at, and $47,300 was the most concrete number in her life at this moment. The chamber she was sitting in held a quantity of gold that was to $47,300 roughly what the Pacific Ocean was to a cup of water. She also thought about Mia's school, which cost $200 a month in materials and activities that the district technically covered but practically did not. She thought about the refrigerator that made its sound every 30 seconds. She thought about the truck payment. She thought about the specific texture of the anxiety that woke her up at 3 in the morning on the last week of every month when the account was at its lowest and the next paycheck was still days away. The sensation of living inside a margin too thin for any unexpected thing. All of that was real. All of it was currently true. And all of it was also, from where she was sitting in this granite chamber, a problem that had a solution. A solvable problem. That was a thought she had not had in 18 months, and it arrived now with a force she was not prepared for, quiet and enormous, and she sat with it for a moment before she allowed herself to move. She picked up the journal and kept reading. Joseph had written about the engineering of the chamber in the journal's second half. He had trained himself in basic masonry from a book he ordered from a publisher in Philadelphia, and he had spent the first winter after finding the cave working out how to build something that would last. The chamber was not inside the cave itself, which he judged to be too open and too discoverable. The chamber was adjacent to the cave, connected to it by a short passage he had cut from granite over the course of 4 winters, using hand tools and the patience of a man who had a long plan. He had chosen the sequoia because it was the oldest and most permanent thing in the landscape, the one feature he could be certain would still be standing in 100 years, in 200, possibly in 1,000. He had built the iron door himself, working with a blacksmith in a town 3 days' ride from the mountains who never knew what the door was for, only that the customer wanted something heavy and precise and willing to last. He had designed the locking mechanism and made the components himself over 3 winters, the work of long evenings in a cabin he rented near the western edge of the timber territory. He had made the medallion from a brass casting he poured himself in the same cabin, using a mold he had carved from soapstone, pressing the symbols into both faces of the mold before pouring. He had also treated the iron. The journal's technical section described a process he had learned from a pamphlet from a manufacturer in Pittsburgh, a linseed oil and pine tar compound baked into the iron surface at high heat that had been used on ship fittings for a century and was, by the manufacturer's claim, resistant to corrosion for as long as the base metal held. He had applied it to every iron surface in the chamber: the door, the frame, the shelving brackets, the chest bands. He had applied it 3 times to the door itself and twice to the passage entrance frame. He had made no claim in the journal that it would work for 100 years. He had written only that he had done what he knew to do and trusted the material. The material had held 144 years, and it had held. The symbols were his own invention. He had sat one winter and worked out a geometric system that was internally consistent but not derived from any existing notation, a private language with exactly one purpose. He had written the key to the symbols in the journal's final pages, a careful diagram of the system, so that whoever came with the medallion could understand what they were reading on the door. He had given the medallion to his wife Martha with instructions: keep it in the family. Give it to a woman when the time comes. Give it to one who spends time outdoors, who knows the mountains or can learn them. Give it to one who will understand what it means to find something important and to think carefully about what to do with it. He had written one more thing on the final page of the journal, below the symbol key, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, which suggested he had written it later, perhaps much later, perhaps near the end. I am not a rich man by the measure of the world I live in. The gold is in the mountain. I have touched only what I needed, enough to keep myself and Martha comfortable and to put a little aside. What remains is not mine to spend, and I was never certain it was mine to find. I leave the question of what to do with it to the person who reads this. They will be of my blood, and they will be standing in a better position than I am to know what the right thing is. I trust them to know it when they see it. Nora read that paragraph 3 times. She set the journal down on the stone-top desk and took her phone from her pack and checked it. No signal, as expected. She checked the time. She had been inside the chamber for just over an hour and a half. Outside, the May afternoon was moving toward its midpoint, and she had a 7-mile return hike in front of her, and she had not yet looked at the thing she had noticed on the way into the journal, the thing that had caught her eye in the maps section and that she had promised herself she would come back to. The rolled leather cylinders on the right-hand shelves. She had assumed they were documents related to the extraction records. She went to them now and chose the largest, which was at the back of the top shelf, and worked the iron wire binder loose and unrolled the leather on the stone floor of the chamber. It was a map, hand-drawn, the lines in ink that had faded to brown but remained legible, the scale indicated at the bottom in Joseph's careful hand. It showed the valley and the surrounding formations, the creek in its course, the granite outcroppings, the position of the chamber relative to the sequoia grove, and extending away from the chamber, deeper into the granite formation to the east, marked with a set of parallel lines and notations that she had to lean close to read, was something else. She leaned close and read it. The notation was in Joseph's hand. Primary deposit formation, unexplored. Extent unknown. Depth approximately 60 to 80 feet below surface at point of access. Color and character consistent with a primary load source for all alluvial material in this drainage. Primary load. She had enough geology from her ranger training and from 12 years of walking Sierra Nevada country to know what that meant in context. The alluvial gold Joseph had spent 11 years extracting from the cave had come from somewhere. All alluvial gold came from somewhere, a primary vein source that erosion had been breaking down over geological time, releasing particles that water then moved and deposited in lower gradient formations. The deposit Joseph had found was the secondary formation, the alluvial product. The map showed what he believed was the primary source. If the secondary deposit had yielded 2,347 pounds of gold in 11 years of careful extraction, the primary load was a different category of thing altogether. Lode deposits were measured in tons, not pounds. Their extraction required infrastructure and investment and, under federal land law, permits and royalties and regulatory oversight. They could not be quietly mined with hand tools over winter seasons. Joseph had found it. He had marked it. He had not touched it. And he had hidden the map here for 144 years. Nora sat back on her heels on the stone floor and looked at the map and tried to think clearly about what she was looking at. The secondary deposit, the coins and the raw gold in the chests and crates surrounding her, was worth somewhere in the range of $150 million to $200 million at current prices. That was the number she had been building towards since she opened the first crate. And it was a number that still did not feel fully real, but she could hold it. She had been running the math for an hour, and it kept landing in the same range. The primary load formation marked on the map was a different scale of thing. She did not know enough to value it. Nobody could value it without a geological survey and a drilling program and the kind of analysis that took months and millions of dollars of its own to produce. What she knew was that if Joseph's notation was accurate, if the primary source of an alluvial deposit that had produced 2,347 pounds of gold was what he thought it was, the number it represented was not in millions. It was in another category. She was sitting in a national monument. The land was federal. Whatever was under it belonged to the federal government under the mining law frameworks that had been in place since the 1870s and had been revised and amended many times since. Joseph's extraction, technically, had been illegal, though the statute of limitations on a crime committed in 1879 by a man who died in 1923 was a legal question she was not equipped to answer in a granite chamber with no phone signal and 2 hours of daylight remaining for the hike out. What she knew was that she needed to get out of this chamber, get to a ridgeline where the radio could reach the repeater, and call someone. The question was who. Dan Faraday was her supervisor, and she trusted him in the way you trust a person you have worked alongside for 12 years, which was completely in the ways that mattered and with clear awareness of the ways it didn't. Dan was a good ranger and a fair supervisor, and he would pick up the radio and tell his supervisor, and his supervisor would tell someone in the regional office, and within 48 hours there would be an official process, a federal process, the kind of process that was thorough and slow and ended in outcomes determined by law rather than by the intentions of the people inside it. That was the right path. She knew that. She was a federal employee. She was standing in a federal land management area. She had found something of potentially enormous value and historical significance on federal land, and the correct thing to do was to report it through the correct channels and let the process work. She also knew, sitting in this chamber with Joseph's journal in her lap and the medallion in her pocket and the map of the primary lode on the floor in front of her, that the process would not ask what Joseph had wanted. The process did not have a mechanism for asking what a dead man had intended when he sealed his family's inheritance inside a tree that had been alive for 27 centuries. It had mechanisms for determining legal ownership of extracted minerals and for managing newly identified deposits on federal land, and those mechanisms would produce outcomes whether or not anyone in them had read the final page of Joseph's journal. I leave the question of what to do with it to the person who reads this. They will be of my blood. I trust them to know the right thing when they see it. She sat in the granite chamber for a few more minutes and took photographs of everything she could reach. The shelves, the chests, the journal, page by page, as many pages as she could get before the phone battery warned her to stop. The map, the writing desk, the door from the inside, the passage leading back to the tree's hollow. She photographed Joseph's handwriting on the final page. She photographed the symbol key. She photographed the primary lode notation on the map 3 times from different angles, making sure the words were legible. Then she wrapped the journal back in its leather and replaced the iron plate over it. She pushed the map cylinder back onto its shelf. She closed the first chest and made sure the latch was seated. She made sure she had touched nothing that she could not exactly replace, the way she worked any site that was both crime scene and historical artifact, which was a kind of site she had worked before, though never one quite like this. She walked back through the passage and into the hollow and out through the gap between the roots and stood in the grove in the afternoon light and breathed air that was warm and smelled of living things rather than stone. The door was still open behind her. She could see the passage entrance through the root gap, the darkness of the corridor leading back to the chamber. She took her radio from her belt and looked at it, and then looked at the ridgeline to the east where she might be able to raise the repeater if she climbed 1,000 feet. She had an hour and 40 minutes before she needed to start the hike back to make it to the truck before dark. She had a phone with photographs of a journal that had been sealed in granite for 144 years. She had a medallion that had been passed down through 4 generations of women with the understanding that the right person would know what to do with it. She was standing in the middle of the oldest tree in the monument, in the most remote corner of a wilderness that most people would never see, with a decision in front of her that was going to shape the rest of her life regardless of which direction she chose. The radio was heavy in her hand. She turned it over and looked at the channel dial and the transmit button, and the antenna folded against the side. The light in the grove was going amber. The grandmother's bark caught it the way it always caught late afternoon light, going from red-brown to something warmer, something that made the tree look, at this hour, like it was lit from the inside. 27 centuries of afternoon light on the same bark. The same quality of light on a different world each time. She had 45 minutes before she needed to start climbing toward the ridgeline. She put the radio back on her belt and sat down against the surface root of the grandmother and thought about Joseph Callahan, who had sat in these mountains for 12 years making a decision one season at a time, and about Eileen, who had kept a medallion for 50 years without explaining it to anyone, and about Mia, who was 9 years old and making her own lunch in the morning in a drafty house because she understood, without it being explained to her, that her mother was carrying something heavy. She thought about what it meant to be trusted by someone who was not alive to explain the trust. What it meant to have something pressed into your hand by a dying woman who said you will know when it matters. She thought about the women who had carried the medallion before Eileen. Martha Callahan, Joseph's wife, who had kept the secret of her husband's years in the mountains through a lifetime in Missouri and then California. And Martha's daughter, whose name Nora did not know, who had passed it to hers. A chain of women, each one keeping a thing they did not fully understand, trusting that the understanding would come when it was needed, trusting that the person at the end of the chain would be the right person. That was a lot of trust to place in someone. Nora sat with her back against a root that had been growing for 27 centuries and looked up through the crown of the grandmother at the sky, which was going from blue to the deeper blue of late afternoon, the first suggestion of evening entering the light. She had 40 minutes before she absolutely had to start moving. Maybe 45. She thought about what came after the phone call. Whatever call she made, whoever she made it to, the next days were going to be something she had no template for. Federal involvement was certain, the land being what it was. Lawyers were probable. The question of what Joseph's extraction meant legally, what the land filings meant, what Nora's status as a direct descendant of the person who had built the chamber meant in terms of any claim she could make. All of that was going to require expertise she did not have, and time she did not have, and money she could not currently afford. She also thought about the primary lode. The formation marked on the map, the one Joseph had found and documented and deliberately not touched. It was under federal land. Its existence, once disclosed, would trigger a mandatory reporting process under federal mining law, would require geological assessment, would draw the attention of every mineral extraction interest in the industry. The monument's protected status might insulate it from exploitation. It might not. The history of protected federal land in the western United States was not an uncomplicated history when significant mineral wealth was found beneath it. She did not know how to hold all of that at once. She was a park ranger who had found something in a tree. She was the great-great-granddaughter of the man who had put it there. She was a person with a debt of $47,300 and a 9-year-old daughter who made her own lunch in a housing situation that was under review, and she was also a federal employee with legal obligations that did not bend because of personal circumstances, and she was also the person Joseph Callahan had been waiting for. She thought about what he had written on the final page. They will be of my blood, and they will be standing in a better position than I am to know what the right thing is. I trust them to know it when they see it. She had not seen it yet. Not fully. She had the shape of the situation, and she had the scope of it, and she had the weight of it. But she did not yet know the right thing, because the right thing required more information than she currently had, required the input of people who knew things she did not know, required, at minimum, a legal professional who worked in federal land and mineral rights law, and who would tell her what her options actually were before the official process removed all options from her hands. That was who she was going to call. Not Dan. Not the regional office. A lawyer. She had $231 in her checking account. She did not know what an attorney consultation in federal land law cost. She suspected it cost more than $231. She stood up, brushed the bark and debris from the back of her pants, looked at the gap between the surface roots where the iron door was still open in the dark inside the tree, and made a decision about what she was going to do for the next 12 hours. She was going to close the door. She was going to hike out. She was going to drive to a spot where her phone had signal. She was going to take the photographs on her phone and send them to the one person she trusted completely outside the official structure of her work, The one person who had the knowledge and the judgment and the personal loyalty that the situation required. And she was going to ask for help. She was going to do all of that before she told anyone else a single word about what she had found. She went back through the root gap into the hollow of the tree and crossed to the iron door and took hold of the ring and pulled it closed. The mechanism ran its sequence in reverse as the door seated. The same careful sounds in the opposite direction, each component returning to its position. The gap around the frame closing until there was no gap. The iron returning to the state of sealed and settled and silent that it had maintained for 144 years. She pressed the medallion against the symbols one more time and felt the final tumbler fall home. And then she put the medallion back in her pocket and went out through the gap between the roots and stood in Cathedral Grove in the late afternoon light. The door was behind her, and the gold was behind the door, and the map was behind the gold. And she had photographs of all of it on a phone with 23% battery. And she had 7 miles of mountain between here and the truck, and she had a decision that was going to take more than one evening to make properly. She shouldered her pack and started east toward the ridgeline, where the radio might reach the repeater. She did not yet know what she was going to say when it did. But she had the walk to work it out, and the walk was 7 miles, and she had always done her clearest thinking in motion. 7 miles through this forest at this hour, the light changing as the sun moved west behind the ridge, the sequoias shifting from the amber of late afternoon toward the cooler gray of early evening. 7 miles to decide what kind of person she was going to be in the next chapter of her life. Not what kind of ranger, or what kind of daughter, or what kind of mother, though all of those were in it. What kind of person? Whether she was the kind who, when handed something extraordinary, reached first for herself or first for the question of what was right. Whether the two things could be the same thing. Whether Joseph Callahan, who had faced a version of this question in a cave in 1879, had answered it in a way she could live with and build from. She thought he had. She thought the sealed door and the medallion and the last page of the journal and the careful architecture of everything he had left behind was the answer of a man who had taken the question seriously and done his best with it. She was going to try to do the same. She reached the ridgeline at 6:47 in the evening. The eastern escarpment dropped away below her, and the high desert spread out in the fading light. The Owens Valley a thin dark line between two ranges, the air up here cool enough that she could see her breath for the first time since April. She had climbed 1,000 feet above Cathedral Grove in 90 minutes, moving faster than her usual field pace, the kind of speed that comes not from urgency exactly, but from the need to be doing something with a body that has been asked to hold too much stillness. She checked the radio first. 3 bars on the repeater signal. She checked her phone. 2 bars of cell service, barely usable, but usable. She did not call Dan. She sat on a flat section of granite at the ridgeline's edge, the wind coming off the desert below and pushing through her jacket, and she looked at the phone in her hand and thought about the right sequence of things. There was a version of this evening in which she called her supervisor, followed protocol, handed the situation to the federal structure it technically belonged to, and went home. That version was the simplest version. It was probably the one a ranger with 12 years of service and a clear professional record was supposed to choose. She scrolled to a name she had not called in 14 months. Claire Soto picked up on the second ring, which was either luck or the specific timing of the call, which happened to fall at a moment when Claire was between the office and her car in a parking garage in Fresno with nothing in her hands. Nora, what's wrong? Because Claire had known Nora since they were both 21 years old at UC Davis, and she had learned that Nora did not call without reason. Nothing's wrong, Nora said, but I need a lawyer. I need you specifically, and I need you to not ask me questions on the phone. A pause. Where are you? Top of a ridge 7 miles from where I parked. I'm going to send you something when I get to the truck. Don't open it until I tell you I'm safe and driving. Another pause, longer. Nora, I know. I'll explain everything. Just don't open it until I call. She hiked down in the dark, using her headlamp, taking the 7 miles at a pace that was slower than the ascent but steadier, and she thought about Joseph Callahan walking this same country in the dark 144 years ago with considerably less equipment and considerably more at stake, and she felt something that was not quite kinship but was in the same family. She got to the truck at 9:41. She sat in the cab with the heater running and sent Claire the photographs from the phone. All of them. The chamber, the shelves, the chests, the coins in the crate, the journal's pages, The final page with Joseph's handwriting, the map, the primary load notation. Then she called. Claire answered before the first ring completed. There was a quality to her silence when she answered that Nora recognized from their years of friendship. The silence of a person who has just seen something that has changed the size of the room they're standing in. That's a real journal, Claire said. That handwriting, the paper, the leather wrapping. That's not recent. No. And the coins in those photographs. Yes. Nora, where exactly is this? Giant Sequoia National Monument. 7 miles in. Inside a sequoia tree. The silence on Claire's end lasted long enough that Nora checked to make sure the call was still connected. Okay, Claire finally said, and her voice had shifted to the one she used when she was working, clipped and precise, and moving through a checklist only she could see. You haven't told anyone else. Not yet. Good. Don't. Not until we talk in person. Can you come to Fresno tomorrow morning, or do you need me to come to you? I'll come to you. 7 a.m., if that works. I'll be there at 6:30. Get some sleep if you can. She drove 3 hours back to the monument and pulled into the housing unit parking area just before 1 in the morning and sat in the truck for 10 minutes before she went inside. The lights were off in the housing units down the row. Mia was at her father's this week, Tuesday through Friday. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen when she came through the door, its 30-second cycle happening once while she was standing in the entry still in her field boots, and she looked at it and felt something she had not felt in a long time when she looked at that refrigerator, which was that it was going to be replaced. She was at Claire's office at 6:58 the next morning. Claire Soto was 41 years old and had been practicing environmental and federal land law for 14 years, the last 7 as a partner in a firm in Fresno that handled cases nobody else wanted because they were too complicated or too politically sensitive or both. She had a wall of case files that ran floor to ceiling on 2 sides of her office and a desk that looked like something an aircraft carrier had been named after, and she was already behind it when Nora arrived with 2 coffees from the place on the block. She had printed the photographs Nora had sent. All of them. They were spread across the desk in a pattern that showed she had been looking at them for a while before Nora arrived. Sit down, she said. Tell me everything. Start with the medallion. Nora told her everything, in the order it had happened. The medallion and Eileen's hospital room. The storm and the assignment. The gap in the route plate and the hollow in the door. The 4 minutes and 22 seconds. The passage and the chamber and the chests and the crates. Reading the journal. The map. Claire listened without interrupting, which was one of the things that made her a good attorney and also one of the things that had made her a good friend for 20 years. She took notes in the margin of one of the printed photographs with a fine-point pen, small and dense. She asked 3 clarifying questions at the end. She did not express surprise in a way that disrupted the conversation, which Nora appreciated, because she needed someone who could take it in and move immediately to what it meant. When Nora finished, Claire looked at what she had written and then looked up. The 1872 mining law, she said. Do you know it? Enough. Joseph filed mineral claims. They're in the flat boxes you described. I need to see those documents, because if they were valid claims at the time of filing, and if they covered the area of the cave and the drainage, then his extraction was legal under the law as it stood. The 1872 law gave any citizen the right to stake a claim and extract minerals from federal land. The land wasn't protected until decades after he sealed that chamber. So the gold was legally his. If the claims were valid, yes. He extracted it legally, stored it legally in a structure he built legally on claimed land, and it passed as personal property to his estate when he died. The fact that the land later became a national monument doesn't retroactively make his prior legal extraction illegal. She paused. There will be a royalty question. The standard federal mineral royalty rate is 12.5%. The government will want that on the extracted value. That's a negotiation. How much does 12.5% of $150 million look like? About $18 million on the high estimate. Probably negotiated down from there because the extraction happened before federal land protection existed and the legal framework was different. The government may settle for 8 or 10% rather than litigate a 140-year-old claim. Claire tapped the photograph of the map. This is the complicated piece. The primary load. The primary load is in-ground mineral wealth on federal land. Under current law, it belongs to the federal government. You have to disclose it. That's not optional. As a federal employee who has knowledge of a significant mineral deposit on the land you manage. I know, but disclosing it does not mean it gets mined. The monument's existing protection likely prohibits commercial extraction. What it means is that the Federal Geological Service sends people in. They confirm what Joseph suspected, they assess the formation, and then the political question of what to do with it begins. My advice is that you disclose it as part of the official report, with the recommendation clearly stated that extraction would be incompatible with the monument's protected status. Put your position on the record from the start. What do I say to Dan? Claire looked at the photograph of the iron door. You tell Dan today, this morning. You cannot sit on this longer than 24 hours as a federal employee. But you tell him that you have engaged legal counsel and that you will be making a full disclosure through the proper channels with your attorney present. That's your right. It's not obstruction. It's just competent self-representation. Nora called Dan from the parking lot of Claire's building at 8:45 in the morning. Dan picked up on the third ring with his usual flat hello, the one that didn't change whether the call was routine or not. She had always appreciated that about him. She told him she had found something in Cathedral Grove the day before that was outside the scope of the damage assessment. She told him she had engaged a federal land attorney and would be making a full disclosure that morning. She told him the disclosure was going to require the involvement of people significantly above both of their pay grades. Dan was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? He said. Are you personally safe? Yes. Did you take anything from the site? No. Okay. Another pause, the kind that meant he was recalibrating. I'm going to have to report this conversation immediately, Nora. You understand that? I know. That's what I want you to do. This is going to be a very long day for both of us. It is. I'll make coffee, he said, and hung up. The official disclosure happened in a conference room in the Regional Federal Building in Fresno at 11 that morning. Claire sat beside Nora. A representative from the Forest Service and one from the Department of the Interior sat on the other side of the table with a third person whose exact agency Nora was never fully clear on, but who took very detailed notes. Dan was on a conference line from the monument. Nora walked them through everything. The photographs were projected on a screen. When the image of the chamber came up, the woman from the Department of the Interior made a sound that was not quite a word. When the map appeared, with its notation of the primary lode formation, the man from the Forest Service leaned forward and stayed leaned forward for the rest of the meeting. By 3 in the afternoon, a preliminary team was being assembled to access Cathedral Grove the following morning. Claire had already filed the legal paperwork establishing Nora's status as a claimant under Joseph Callahan's estate. The process had begun. They went into the chamber 4 days later, on a Saturday morning with a team of 12 people that included federal agents, an archaeological preservation specialist, 2 coin and precious metals appraisers who had been flown in from San Francisco, a geologist from the U.S. Geological Survey, and Nora, who led them in through the root gap of the grandmother and through the passage and into the stone room with the flashlights they had brought, because she had told them what was there, and they had not quite believed her until they were standing in it. The preservation specialist, a woman named Dr. Ananya Verma, who worked for the Smithsonian's Office of Archaeometry, moved through the chamber the way Nora had moved through it, slowly and with her hands behind her back, looking before she touched anything. She spent a long time at the journal on the writing desk, reading it in its place before she opened the iron plate that covered it and lifted it for examination. When she closed the final page and set the journal back on the stone surface, she looked at Nora. He built this in the 1880s, she said. The masonry technique, the iron treatment, the general construction methodology. It's all consistent with that period. This chamber is going to need full archaeological documentation before anything is moved. One of the coin appraisers had opened the first crate and was moving through the coins with the careful speed of someone who knows exactly what they are looking at and is checking a long internal list. He had been at it for 40 minutes when he stopped and held a coin under his magnifying loupe for a long moment, and then set it down and looked at his colleague. 1880 S, he said. His colleague nodded, already writing. The 1880 S was a San Francisco mint double eagle with a mintage of slightly over 1 million coins, most of which had entered circulation and been lost to the usual attritions of coin survival. High-grade uncirculated specimens from this date and mint were not common. AMS 64 or better could sell at auction in the mid to upper five figures. The crate was full of them in grades that had been protected by the dry sawdust packing and the stable climate of the chamber for 140 years. The appraiser looked across the room at the other 29 crates and ran a visible calculation in his expression. "We're going to need more time," he said. The full appraisal took 3 weeks. The archaeological documentation took 2 months, running parallel to the legal proceedings. Dr. Verma's team carefully cataloged every object in the chamber, each coin photographed individually, each leather cylinder opened and documented. Joseph's journal transcribed word for word by a team of 2 archivists who worked from high-resolution scans to avoid handling the original more than necessary. The map was reproduced at full scale. The land claim documents in the flat wooden boxes were extracted with gloved hands and sent to a document conservation laboratory in Washington. Dr. Verma had said something to Nora during the second day of documentation, standing in the passage between the hollow and the chamber, that had stayed with her. She had said that in 30 years of working archaeological sites, she had encountered very few that showed this kind of intentionality. This evidence that the person who built it was thinking explicitly about the long term, about conditions that would change and materials that would degrade, and what would and would not survive. Joseph had thought about his clay and his iron and his stone and his leather and the dry air of the granite and the tree above and how they would each behave over 100 years, and he had made decisions based on that thinking, and the decisions had been correct. Dr. Verma said she wished more people who built things thought the way he had. Nora had not known how to respond to that without talking about Joseph in a way that would have taken longer than the moment allowed. So she had just said yes, and meant it, and they had gone back into the chamber to continue the work. The primary load was assessed by the geological team. They went in through a separate approach, accessing the cave Joseph had described in the journal through the landslide-exposed entrance on the far side of the granite formation. What they found took another 3 weeks to fully characterize. The preliminary report, which Nora received a redacted copy of through Claire's office, described a primary vein deposit of gold and associated minerals of significant extent and high concentration running along a fault line in the granite formation at depths between 40 and 90 feet below surface. The full characterization of the deposit's extent would require drilling, which was not authorized under the monument's protection status. The preliminary estimate of recoverable gold, based on surface samples and ground-penetrating radar, was given as a range with a low end in the billions of dollars. Nora read that number and set the report down and went for a walk. The conservation question came to a head at a formal public comment period 6 months after the initial disclosure. The monument's superintendent, under pressure from multiple directions, opened the primary load question to public input. Mining interests argued for a legislative exemption to the monument's protected status. Conservation organizations opposed extraction in terms that generated significant media attention. The state's congressional delegation divided along lines that had nothing to do with geology. Nora testified at the comment period. She was a federal employee and had been careful throughout the proceedings about what she said publicly and when, following Claire's guidance. But the comment period was the right venue, and she had prepared carefully. She told the panel that she had spent 12 years in this forest and had walked Cathedral Grove perhaps 30 times in that period, and that the grove was in the condition it was in because the land around it had been protected from extraction for the past century. She told them that the primary lode deposit had been under that granite for millions of years before Joseph Callahan found it and documented it, and before that it had been under the land that 100 generations of indigenous people had lived on and cared for, and that the deposit's value was real and large, and that it should stay in the ground. She told them that the reason a 2,700-year-old tree was still standing and healthy in that grove was that the things around it had been allowed to stay where they were. The monument's protection held. The lode was designated a permanent geological preserve feature. No extraction permit would be issued without an act of Congress that would face immediate legal challenge. The decision was not unanimous, and the political pressure did not disappear, but the immediate question was resolved. The legal proceedings around the gold took 8 months in total. Claire was meticulous, and the opposing federal counsel was fair rather than aggressive, which helped. The critical question was the validity of Joseph's mineral claims. 3 of the 11 document boxes contained claim filings that were in the name of Joseph M. Callahan, filed at the Tulare County Land Office between 1879 and 1883, covering the specific acreage of the cave and drainage in which he had found the secondary deposit. The documents were authenticated by the federal archivist, confirmed as legitimate filings in the county record of that period. Joseph's extraction had been legal under the 1872 mining law as it existed at the time. The gold was his. It had passed to his estate. His estate had passed intestate, which meant it had descended to his wife Martha, then to their children, then through the documented family line, arriving at Eileen as the last living direct heir, and then, per Eileen's will, to Nora. The government negotiated a royalty settlement. The final rate, after 3 months of discussion, was 9% of the total appraised value of the extracted minerals. The total appraised value of the raw gold and the coin collection came to $203 million. The 9% royalty was $18.27 million, paid to the federal treasury, earmarked by a provision Claire had insisted on for monument conservation and research. Nora's net share was $184.73 million. She sat in Claire's office the afternoon the settlement was signed and looked at the number on the document in front of her, and then looked out the window at the parking garage across the street. A seagull was sitting on the top level of the garage, as seagulls will do in Fresno for reasons that have never been fully explained, and she looked at the seagull for about a minute. "What do I do now?" she said. "Whatever you want," Claire said. "Within reason and the applicable tax law." She paid the debt first. The full $47,300, plus a year of accrued interest, in a single payment that required her to transfer funds between accounts for the first time in her life in an amount that made the bank's fraud detection system flag the transaction. She sat on hold for 11 minutes while a representative confirmed that yes, she was the account holder and yes, she intended to make the payment. She said yes twice and hung up and sat with the specific feeling of that number being gone. And it was not a triumphant feeling, it was quieter than that. It was the feeling of something that had been pressing on her for 18 months lifting away. She thought about the bank notification that had gone off 4 times a month for a year and a half. The sound of it on the counter in the mornings. She would not miss that sound. She did not feel victorious about its absence. She felt the way she imagined you feel when a persistent small pain simply stops. Not euphoric, just finally comfortable. Finally able to put your attention on other things. She called Mia's school and established a college savings account, fully funded, in Mia's name. She paid 14 months of back school materials fees that she had been negotiating payment plans on. She set up automatic payments for everything that had ever required her to think about whether she could afford it that month. The Conservation Fund's first grant also funded a paid research fellowship program for undergraduate students from low-income backgrounds who wanted to study old-growth forest ecology. Nora had approved it without much deliberation, because it was exactly the kind of thing that felt connected to what Joseph had wanted, which was for what he found to benefit people who would take care of it. Then she called the Park Service housing office and asked to speak with the administrator who managed the benefit review. The administrator was a man named Gerald Fitch who had the manner of someone who managed processes rather than people and who had never particularly registered Nora as an individual in their 3 previous interactions. He answered the phone with his usual efficiency. "I wanted to let you know," Nora said, "that the housing benefit review doesn't need to factor my unit in. I'm going to be purchasing a house in the area. I just wanted you to have that information for your numbers." A pause. "You're voluntarily removing yourself from the subsidized housing program." "Yes. I'd like to give 30 days notice and maintain my eligibility for the ranger station assignment regardless of housing." Yes, of course. You retain your assignment regardless of housing status." He sounded like a man who was used to delivering bad news and was recalibrating for an interaction that didn't require any. "Is there anything else I can help you with, Ranger Callahan?" "No," she said. "I think that covers it." She bought a house 8 miles from the monument entrance, a 3-bedroom on 2 acres with a stand of pines in the backyard and a porch that faced east toward the ridgeline, where she had stood with her radio the evening she came down from Cathedral Grove. It was not an expensive house by the measure of what she could now afford. It was exactly the size she wanted. Mia had her own room with a window that looked at the pines, and there was a second room for the work Nora was beginning to plan, and a kitchen with a refrigerator that did not hum. She told Mia on a Tuesday evening in October, 3 months after the settlement. Mia was 9.5 and was sitting at the kitchen table in the new house doing the math worksheet that was giving her the most difficulty, the long division unit, working through it with the focused patience that was one of Mia's characteristic qualities. Nora made tea for herself and put a cup of hot chocolate in front of Mia and sat down across from her and waited for a stopping point. Mia set her pencil down and wrapped her hands around the mug. "Mom, I have something to tell you," Nora said. "It's a long story. I want to tell you the whole thing." She told Mia about Joseph Callahan the same way Eileen had told Nora, not as a legend, but as a person. A man from Missouri who had come to California and walked a mountain range for 30 years and found something in a cave and made a decision about what to do with it. She told her about Martha, who had kept the medallion and passed it to her daughter. She told her about the chain of women and the brass disc that had ended up in a glove compartment in a Park Service truck. She told her about the storm and the root gap and the iron door. She told her about reading the journal in the stone chamber with the flashlight. Mia listened the way she listened to everything important, without interrupting, her hands still around the mug. "You were scared," Mia said when Nora stopped. "Yes, several times. But you went in anyway." "I did." Mia thought about this. "How much is it?" "The money." "A lot. More than we'll ever need." "Are we going to be okay?" Nora looked at her daughter, at Marcus's eyes in a face that was entirely its own, at the child who made her own lunch and wrote notes that said, "Mom, there is coffee," even when there wasn't. "We've been okay," she said. "We're going to be more okay." Mia nodded, taking this seriously. "What are you going to do with it?" "Some of it I'm going to use for us. The house, your school, your future. Some of it I'm going to put into a fund for the monument. To keep it the way it is. To study it, protect it. In Joseph's name." She paused. "I want you to know about it. About where it came from and why he hid it and what he wanted." "He wanted you to find it," Mia said. "Not as a question. He wanted someone like me to find it. He didn't know me. He trusted that eventually someone in the family would be right for it." Mia was quiet for a moment, looking down at the hot chocolate. "Great-great-great-grandpa Joseph," she said, making him real by giving him his full relational position, which was a very Mia thing to do. She looked at the medallion, which was on the table between them. Nora had put it there at the start of the conversation without deciding to. The way you put something on the table when it belongs to the conversation. "Can I hold it?" Nora slid it across the table. Mia picked it up and turned it over in her hands, looking at both faces, the same way Nora had looked at it in the hospital room in Fresno, and the way Eileen had held it for 50 years. "It's heavy," Mia said. "Gold has that. Everything Joseph made has that quality. More solid than you expect." Mia set it down between them again and looked at it. Did he know it would take this long? I think he thought it might. The tree he put it in was already 2,000 years old when he found it. He was thinking in long time. Mia picked up her pencil again and looked at the math worksheet, and then looked back at Nora. "Mom, you should have a piece of chocolate." Nora laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere lower than the chest, the kind that surprises you with how much it needs to get out. And Mia looked pleased with herself in the specific way of a child who has produced an effect she was aiming for. Nora got the chocolate from the cabinet and broke off a piece and sat back down, and they stayed at the kitchen table together while Mia finished the long division. And it was one of the better evenings Nora could remember in recent years. The Joseph Callahan Conservation Fund was formally established 14 months after the settlement. Claire helped structure it as a nonprofit with a board that included a Sierra Nevada ecologist, a representative from a regional indigenous land rights organization, a federal land historian, and Nora as chair. The fund's initial endowment was $30 million, contributed from Nora's settlement. Its purpose was to support research, preservation, and protection of old-growth sequoia habitat in the monument and surrounding forest, with a secondary focus on funding the documentation and interpretation of historical land use in the Sierra Nevada region. The first grant was for $400,000, awarded to a joint program between UC Davis and the National Park Service for long-term monitoring of old-growth sequoia root systems, a project that had been waiting for funding for 6 years. The second grant funded the Monument Visitor Center's expansion of its historical interpretation program, including a permanent exhibit on the history of the Cathedral Grove area from the pre-contact period through Joseph's time and into the present. The exhibit included a climate-controlled case displaying a high-resolution facsimile of Joseph's journal alongside the original land claim documents and a photograph of the iron door. The final page of the journal, the one with Joseph's handwriting about trusting the person who came after him, was printed at 3 times its original size on the exhibit wall. Dr. Verma's team at the Smithsonian completed the full archaeological documentation of the chamber 18 months after the initial disclosure. The chamber itself was sealed again with the original iron door, which was preserved in place and designated a historical feature of the monument. The medallion, per agreement with the Federal Historical Preservation Office, remained with Nora as a personal artifact of the Callahan family, on permanent loan to the Visitor Center exhibit when Nora was not carrying it, which was often. She carried it most days. Not in the glove compartment anymore. In her field pants pocket, where it sat warm and small and present, the way it had been sitting since the morning of the storm assessment, the morning she had taken it out without knowing quite why. She went back to Cathedral Grove in March, 7 months after the settlement, on a day that was her own, not an assignment. She signed out with the station, logged it as a personal access visit to the restricted area, and hiked the 7 miles in alone in weather that was gray and cold and threatening rain from the west. The Grove was the way it always was. Enormous and quiet and doing its own work with complete indifference to what anyone had done or found or decided in the months since the storm. The anchor trees were the same. Big Harold was the same. The sisters were the same. The grandmother was the same. And the gap in the root plate had been partially covered by a metal grate installed by the preservation team to prevent unauthorized access while leaving the root structure intact. She had a key to the grate. She opened it and went through on hands and knees the way she had gone through the first time and stood up in the hollow. The passage entrance was visible in the far wall, the iron frame of it dark in the flashlight beam. The door was closed and sealed. The monument, all of that gold and that history and that 140 years of waiting in the dark, and now it was documented and assessed and legally resolved, and the chamber was dark again and sealed, and the tree around all of it was alive and growing the way it had been alive and growing for 27 centuries. Nora sat down on the root floor of the hollow the way she had sat on the floor of the chamber when she was reading the journal, back against the curved wall, flashlight off, in the dark. The dark inside a Sequoia Hollow in Cathedral Grove in March is the most complete dark she had ever experienced, not frightening but total. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing and heartbeat in a way that is, after a minute, calming rather than alarming. She thought about Eileen in the hospital room. She thought about what Eileen had known and had not said directly. She must have understood more than she had let on. She was 91 years old and had kept this object for 50 years and had chosen the right person to give it to. You do not do that without some sense of what it means. She had sat in a hospital room in Fresno and pressed a brass medallion into her granddaughter's hand and said what she said, and then she had died, and she had not known what Nora would find or when or whether the tree would still be standing or whether the door would still hold. Only that she had done her part in the long chain, and that was what she had to offer. "I love you, Grandma," Nora said to the dark, which was not something she was in the habit of saying to the interiors of trees, but the dark inside a Sequoia Hollow in the grove that Joseph Callahan had walked into in 1879 seemed like a reasonable place for it. She had bought a small plot at the Fresno Cemetery near the plot where Eileen and her husband were buried. She had commissioned a grave marker for Joseph and Martha Callahan, who were buried in Missouri in graves whose locations she had tracked down through county records and the Family Genealogical Research Clerk's office had done as part of the estate proceedings. She had ordered companion markers placed at their Missouri graves and had the Fresno marker installed as a memorial, the same way you commemorate someone who mattered when you cannot bring them home. The Fresno marker read Joseph M. Callahan, 1853 to 1923. He found something extraordinary and did right by it. And Martha F. Callahan, 1855 to 1931. She kept the faith for both of them. She had stood at the Fresno Memorial on the morning of its installation and said something she had been composing for a while. She told them the chamber had been opened. She told them the gold was accounted for and the mountain was protected and the journal was in a museum. She told them about Mia, who was their blood and who was doing better at long division. She told them she understood what they had wanted her to do with it, and she had tried to do it. She sat in the dark hollow of the grandmother in March and let the silence be complete for a while. And then she put the flashlight back on and went out through the root gap and stood in the grove and let her eyes adjust to the gray daylight. The grandmother's bark was wet from a rain that had passed while Nora was inside. The grove was very quiet. A woodpecker working somewhere in the high canopy, regular and deliberate, whined through the tops of the trees, the particular sound it made up there, which was different from the sound of wind through any other species, lower and more diffuse, the sound of something very large moving something very large. She stood at the base of the tree for a while with her hand on the bark, feeling the cold and the roughness and the depth of the bark, which was 2 feet thick at the base and which had been adding to itself for 27 centuries, adding its yearly fraction of growth to a structure that had been standing in this specific place since before most of the world's current religious and political traditions existed. She had come here as a ranger for 12 years and had always felt the particular quality of time that the grove imposed on a person standing in it, the sense that your own scale was different from what you had assumed. Today that feeling was the same and also changed, because she had been inside this tree. She had been in the dark at its center and read the words of a man who had put something in its care and trusted it to hold. She had a different relationship to it now than the relationship of ranger to monitored specimen, and she was not sure what to call the new relationship, but it felt specific and real. Joseph had put something in this tree's care. The tree had held it. She had taken it out and done what she could with it. Not perfectly. Not without the legal proceedings and the complicated months and the questions she could not fully answer and the political situation around the primary lode that was not resolved and probably never would be completely resolved. She had done what she could with what she had found, which was what Joseph had asked of her in the only way he had been able to ask it, and she thought she had gotten it right enough to stand beside the tree in the rain and feel that. She was still a ranger. She had kept the assignment, kept the station, kept the 7 a.m. arrival and the coffee maker with the replacement carafe. The work was the same. Trail cameras and seedling counts and explaining to tourists why they could not feed the animals. The difference was that the bank notification did not go off anymore, because the account did not go below $300 anymore, because the account did not bear much resemblance to what it had been in the years of the dead, and the margin too thin for any unexpected thing. She thought about that margin often. The way a person's life could run for years in a space where there was no room for anything to go wrong, where every unexpected thing was a problem before it was anything else. She had lived in that space for 18 months, and she had watched Mia adapt to it without being asked to, and she had made her own lunches and managed her own anxiety and kept going, because that was what you did. And now the space was different. Now there was room, and the room made it possible to notice things again, to look at the grove on a gray March morning and feel something other than the background calculation of whether she could afford to be standing here. The Joseph Callahan Conservation Fund made its first round of grant awards in January of the following year. Nora was at the awards ceremony in a conference room at UC Davis with Dr. Verma, who had become a friend in the way that people become friends through unusual shared experiences, and Claire, who had come because she had done a great deal of the legal work and also because she was Nora's friend, and it was a good day. Dan Faraday was there too, because the fund's first grant included a project that the monument would benefit from, and Dan had been working on that project for 4 years without funding. He shook Nora's hand before the ceremony and held it for a moment. "I should have sent someone else to Cathedral Grove that day," he said, which was his way of saying he was glad he had sent her. "You should have sent me 2 years earlier," she said. "There might have been fewer documents in the legal proceedings." He smiled, which was an expression he did not produce frequently, and which landed, when it appeared, with some weight. "You did right by it," he said. "The whole thing. You did right by it." She thanked him and meant it. Dan was 61 years old and had been a ranger for 22 years and was going to retire in the spring, and Nora had spent a good part of the last 3 months making sure the projects the fund was supporting were structured so that they would continue cleanly after his retirement and whoever came after him. She had built that into the grant structure deliberately. She did not want anything she had set in motion to depend on a specific person being in a specific position, because the lesson she had taken from Joseph was exactly that. If you want something to last, build it to outlast you. The ceremony was an hour long. Dr. Verma spoke about the chamber's historical significance and what it represented for the understanding of how ordinary people had related to the Sierra Nevada landscape in the post-gold rush period. The monument superintendent spoke about the old-growth monitoring program. Claire said a few words about the fund's legal structure that were precise and brief in the way that lawyers are brief when they are being kind about not going longer. Nora spoke last. She talked about Joseph Callahan, the way she had been talking about him for 3 years in various contexts. And it still felt right to talk about him, because he was still the center of the story and the center of the reason anyone was in that room. She talked about what he had chosen and why. She talked about the chain of women who had kept the medallion. She talked about Eileen in the hospital room. She talked about what it felt like to find something extraordinary in a forest you have been walking for 12 years, and to have to decide quickly what kind of person you were going to be about it. The answer had arrived more clearly than she expected, because the question had been put to her by someone who trusted her without knowing her, and that trust turned out to be its own kind of guidance. After the ceremony, Dr. Verma found her in the hallway and said the Smithsonian was interested in hosting a traveling exhibition about the chamber in the following year, and asked if Nora would be willing to loan the medallion for the exhibition period. Nora said yes, without hesitation. She drove home in the early evening, up through the foothills and into the mountains where the air changed quality and the pines appeared, and she thought about the exhibition and about the millions of people who would read about Joseph and Martha and Eileen and not know the full story, the private parts of it, the hospital room and the glove compartment, and the 4 minutes and 22 seconds, and that was fine. The public story was enough. The private story was for her and Mia and the people who had been in it. She pulled into the driveway as the last of the light was leaving the sky. Mia's room window was lit. Nora sat in the truck for a minute with the engine off and the cold mountain air coming in through the cracked window, and she could hear from inside the house the faint sound of her daughter's voice, probably on a video call with a friend, the easy, ordinary sound of a 12-year-old's evening. She took the medallion from her jacket pocket and held it in her palm. The brass was warm from the day. The symbols caught the last light from the western sky. She had been carrying this for 3 years, and before that it had been in Eileen's keeping for 50 years, and before that through each of the women who had carried it back to Martha, who had received it from Joseph's hands. 144 years. She put it back in her pocket and went inside to see her daughter. 3 years after she first crawled through the root gap of Giacinim. 4471, and found the iron door in the dark. Nora Callahan sat on the porch of the house, with the east-facing view, and drank coffee in the early morning, and watched the ridgeline go from gray to gold. Mia was inside asleep, 12 years old now and no longer struggling with long division, having at some point between 9 and 12 made a peace with mathematics that Nora was still somewhat in awe of. The pines in the backyard were doing what pines did in early morning, which was nothing visible and probably a great deal of invisible things that had to do with water and light and the long, slow work of being alive. The medallion was on the kitchen table where she had left it last night. She brought it out most mornings without particular intention, set it next to the coffee cup, looked at the symbols pressed into the brass. She knew what they meant now, the full key from the journal's final pages, a geometric system Joseph had invented alone in a cabin over one winter, a private language with exactly one purpose. The symbols had done their job. They could rest. The monument was doing well. The visitor numbers were up, partly because of the exhibit and partly because the story of the iron door had gotten into the press in ways that Claire had not entirely been able to control, and that had produced a level of public interest in the monument's old-growth sections that the superintendent's office was working to manage responsibly. The Cathedral Grove research area had gone from obscure to famous without the grove itself changing in any way, which was the right outcome. People wanted to know about it. They were being told about it in a way that made them want to protect it rather than visit it, which was also the right outcome. The primary load question stayed quiet. The geological designation held. No legislative challenge had moved through committee in 3 years, partly because the political coalition opposing it had grown, and partly because the story of the chamber and Joseph's decision not to extract the primary deposit had given the conservation argument a human character it had previously lacked. It was easier to argue for leaving something in the ground when there was a specific person who had deliberately chosen to leave it there, who had stood at its edge in 1890 and walked away. She thought about what she would tell Mia when the time came to pass the medallion down. Not the story. Mia already knew the story. What she would tell her was the thing beneath the story, the thing that Joseph had understood and Eileen had understood, and that Nora had been slowly arriving at in the 3 years since the storm had exposed the root gap and changed the shape of her life. The thing was this: what you find is only as important as what you do with it. The gold was in the mountain for millions of years before anyone found it. The chamber held it for 144 more. The value was always there. What changed everything was a person standing in front of something real and asking the right question, which was not "what is this worth," but "what should I do with this?" Joseph had asked it. He had answered it the way he could in 1879, with the tools and the knowledge and the constraints of 1879, and it had been enough. The chain of women who kept the medallion had answered it in their own way, holding the question open for the right moment, trusting that the moment would come. Eileen had answered it in a hospital room in November with a brass disc and 6 words. "You'll know when it matters." She had known. Not immediately. Not without the 4 minutes and 22 seconds of the mechanism working through its sequence. Not without the 7-mile hike out in the dark and the conversation in the parking lot and the months of proceedings. In the morning, she stood at the Fresno Memorial and said what she said to 2 people who had died before she was born. But she had known. The ridgeline was gold now, full sun on the granite, the pines below it catching the light and holding it the way they did in early morning, each needle a small bright point in the larger structure. Somewhere beyond that ridge, 7 miles into country that most people would never see, the oldest tree in the monument was standing in its grove the way it had been standing for 27 centuries, the iron door sealed inside it, the passage empty, the chamber documented and dark and quiet. The mountain held its own. The lode stayed in the ground. The grove grew. And a ranger in the eastern Sierra Nevada drank her coffee in the morning light and understood, in the way you understand things that take years to arrive fully, that she had come from good people who had made hard choices well, and that was the real thing that had been waiting in that chamber all along. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.